Morning Year 11. This is a bit of a bizarre experience, so you'll have to bear with me. We're going to look at a question 2 and a question 3 for English Language Paper 1. So we'll start by reading the text. So this opening of the novel is from a book called The Collector. So it's about a man who collects butterflies, but he becomes obsessed with a girl called Miranda. When she was home from her boarding school, I used to see her almost every day sometimes, because their house was right opposite the town hall annex. She and her younger sister used to go in and out a lot, often with young men, which of course I didn't like. When I had a free moment from the files and ledgers, I stood by the window and used to look down over the road, over the frosting, and sometimes I'd see her. In the evening I marked it in my observations diary, at first with X, and then, when I knew her name, with M. I saw her several times outside too. I stood right behind her once in a queue at the public library down Crossfield Street. She didn't look once at me, but I watched the back of her head and her hair in a long pigtail. It was very pale, silky like burnet cocoons, all in one long pigtail coming down almost to her waist, sometimes in front, sometimes at the back. Sometimes she wore it up. Only once before she came to be my guest here did I have the privilege to see her with it loose, and it took my breath away. It was so beautiful, like a mermaid. Another time, one Saturday off, when I went up to the Natural History Museum, I came back on the same train. She sat 3 seats down and sideways to me and read a book, so I could watch her for 35 minutes. Seeing her always made me feel like I was catching a rarity, going up to it very careful, heart in mouth, as they say. A pale, clouded yellow, for instance. I always thought of her like that. I mean words like elusive and sporadic and very refined. Not like the other ones, even the pretty ones. More for the real connoisseur. Well, then there was the bit in the local paper about the scholarship she'd won and how clever she was, and her name as beautiful as herself, Miranda. So I knew she was up in London studying art. It really made a difference, that newspaper article. It seemed like we became more intimate, although of course we still did not know each other in the ordinary way. Okay, so what we're going to do then, I'm just going to talk you through question 2, and then obviously one of the tasks that you'll need to do later is write up a response. So question 2 is read again the section in bold. How does the writer use language to describe the protagonist's feelings about the girl? And that, as you should know, is 8 marks, and you spend 10 minutes writing your answer. I've just put on there the mark scheme again, just so that you can reflect at the end to make sure that you're covering all of those bullet points. So obviously you need judicious quotations, you need correct subject terminology for language, and you need to analyse effect in detail, because that's where you get your marks. So if we look then at the section in bold, hopefully when I read the text you understood that this protagonist is rather odd in his behaviour. So he seems to be stalking this young girl, and he seems to be quite obsessed with her. You might also have picked up that the reason the novel is called The Collector is primarily because he has an interest in butterflies and moths, these sort of rare exotic insects. So he captures them and he watches them develop from cocoons into butterflies. Now obviously the title of the novel, The Collector, can be interpreted as being a bit more sinister, so perhaps his desire to collect things will actually extend a bit further than just collecting insects, and perhaps possibly it might actually extend to collecting human beings at some point. Okay, so if we look at the section in bold then, some of the things that hopefully you would pick out initially would be things like similes. So if you look, for example, at where it says her hair was very pale, silky like burnet cocoons. A burnet then is a type of rare moth, and a cocoon obviously is the shell or the husk, if you like, that it develops in. So it changes from a caterpillar into the moth with the wings. So when he actually uses this simile to describe her hair, which is in a pigtail, it would suggest firstly that he sees her as being quite exotic, because this moth itself is quite rare and exotic. It also suggests perhaps that her hair, because it's in a braid, because it's in a pigtail, that effectively it's almost enclosed in a cocoon. Now, the reason he collects these cocoons is so that he can see the butterfly or the moth develop and free itself. So by referring to her hair using this simile, it might suggest that his ultimate goal is to see her hair freed from that pigtail. So he wants to see it loose and flowing. The reference to the adjective silky suggests that he is already imagining touching her hair. So it's quite a tactile image and quite sinister for the fact that he gets close to her. He hasn't yet touched her, but it's implied that he wants to touch her hair because he's thinking about the feel of it. The next simile that you might have spotted is towards the end of that section, where he talks again about her hair and says it was so beautiful, like a mermaid. So that simile, comparing her to being like a mermaid, well, if you think of mermaids, they're fictional creatures. So that suggests that this girl is almost like a fantasy. She is unlike a real human being to him. So straight away he is elevating her above other girls, so suggesting that she's some kind of fantasy that he's fixed his sights on. Moreover, you could say that obviously the link to mermaid is the fact that mermaids often are depicted as having very long, beautiful hair. So there's that link as well. And finally, you could perhaps say that a mermaid historically was, another name for a mermaid was a siren. And sirens or mermaids were rumoured to be so beautiful, and they would sing in the water, that when sailors were sailing across the seas, the sailors would be enticed by the mermaids singing, and the mermaids, once they had enticed the sailors in, would pull them into the sea, drag them down to the bottom and drown them. So it's almost suggesting that simile, that this girl is enticing him and he's powerless to resist her charms. So he's almost presenting her as being some kind of temptation that he can't resist, which obviously seems to put the blame on her rather than on himself. So you could look at those two similes. You might also want to look at the fact that the writer uses anaphora. So you can see that there's that repetition of the word sometimes at the beginning of successive clauses. Now, if you are analysing the use of anaphora there, you might suggest that by repetition of sometimes, it's implying that he has seen this girl several times on different occasions, which in itself is quite sinister because it would suggest that he's following her. It's unlikely that every time he sees her it's a pure coincidence. So you could look at the use of anaphora there. You might also want to look at the use of the noun guest. So he talks about when she comes to be his guest here, which we presume is in his house. Now the use of that noun guest you could analyse, because a guest is somebody that is invited and comes to your house of their own free will on invitation. However, the whole text would seem to imply that perhaps this girl has no choice in whether she goes to visit him. So it's an interesting use of word. You could even look at it as a euphemism for the fact that he possibly might kidnap her. So you could look at the use of that noun guest. Finally, you might want to look at the metaphor when he says that The sight of her loose hair one day took my breath away. So obviously that is a metaphor, and it suggests that the girl has a physical effect, or the sight of the girl has a physical effect on him, which in itself is quite sinister because, again, it suggests that he needs to get closer to her to sort of satisfy that physical connection or that physical effect that he's having when he's around her. So have a go at writing an answer. Start with writing about the similes, as you generally should in a language analysis answer, but then possibly look at things like the adjective silky, the anaphora in sometimes, and possibly the metaphor took my breath away, and the noun guessed. So see what you can do in 10 minutes. There's quite a lot there to be getting on with. Okay, we're now going to move on to question 3, which is read the whole text. How has the writer structured the text to interest the reader? So again, it's worth 8 marks and you would have 10 minutes to write your answer. The mark scheme is the same as question 2, but obviously your subject terminology is going to be different. So the top 5 structural features that I've told you to try and look for are always comment on the opening or the beginning, look at the perspective or focus shifts between paragraphs, try and find a pivotal moment, so a turning point or a change of mood or a point where new information is revealed. Always try if you can to spot some juxtaposition, and finally always talk about the ending and consider whether there's any foreshadowing or cliffhanger or circular narrative. Remember that every comment you make about structure has to be linked back to how and why the reader would be interested. Okay, so a couple of the tips that I've given you for question 3 would be firstly to always highlight the opening sentence. So if you look at that opening sentence, I've told you to consider what we are told and what we're not told. So if you look, we're told when she was home from her boarding school. Now, straight away that's interesting to the reader because the writer establishes straight away that somebody is being watched, a young girl. We know that she's a young girl because there's reference to her attending boarding school. However, the reader would be particularly interested because we are not explicitly told who the girl is. So obviously that would intrigue us because we want to know who the girl is, but also who the person is who is following her. Now this is where you could link it to later in the text, a few lines down, because we're told, or the protagonist tells us, that when he had a free moment from the files and ledgers, he would stand by the window and watch her. Now, the fact that he's working with files and ledgers are like folders, would suggest that he is a working adult. So again, this would make it even more interesting, the fact that in the opening sentence we're told that she is a schoolgirl. So you could talk about the beginning. You might then want to highlight the first few words of each paragraph. Now there are only 3 paragraphs in this extract, which makes it a little bit easier in some ways. So if you were looking at how the focus shifts between these paragraphs, we start off then with the first paragraph where he's watching her when she comes home from boarding school. In the second paragraph, he tells us about another time one Saturday off when he actually sees her on the train and he sits and watches her on the train. Now, the focus shift there goes from a general experience of watching her from the window to a very specific occasion when it almost seems like he's planned to get on the same train as her. So that focus shift moves from a general experience of watching her to actually stalking her. He seems to be getting closer. So effectively there's a place shift because at the beginning he's looking through the window, and in the second paragraph he's actually sitting quite close to her on the train. So he's moving closer all of the time. If you then look at the focus shift to the final paragraph, he then talks about how there was the bit in the local paper where he reads about the scholarship that she'd won. So you can see that yet again the focus has shifted even more, because he seems to, or his stalking behaviours seem to be getting more intense. So he seems to be finding out information about her. So you could look at those focus shifts. The next thing you would want to do is find a pivotal moment and talk about that. So if you look at in the first paragraph towards the end, he says, "Only once before she came to be my guest here did I have the privilege to see her with it loose." Now that section where he says, "before she came to be my guest here," is a pivotal moment, because information is being revealed and even foreshadowed. So what is hinted at here is the fact that later in the text, later in the novel, he is going to perhaps either invite her to his house or kidnap her. So it's pivotal because it reveals new information to the reader. Now obviously the reader would be massively interested here, because they are sensing that a very dramatic moment is upcoming in the novel, the moment perhaps where he does kidnap her. So you could look at that as a pivotal moment. The next thing you might want to try and find is juxtaposition. Well, if you look at the end of the second paragraph, he talks about using all of that reference to butterflies and moths, how she is quite elusive and sporadic and refined. So he's suggesting there that she is not like the other ones, even the pretty ones. So what we've got there is the protagonist juxtaposing this girl, Miranda, against all of the other ones, which is in itself quite sinister, because it implies that there have been other girls that he has stalked or watched. However, by juxtaposing her against them, it suggests that she is almost like the ultimate prize. She's far superior to any of the girls that he's ever been interested in before. This would interest the reader then, because they can see perhaps that his stalking behaviours are escalating, they're getting worse, and he's becoming more and more obsessed with the object of his desire, in this case Miranda. And then finally you would look at the end of the extract. So if you look at the final sentence, where it says, "It seemed like we became more intimate, although of course we still did not know each other in the ordinary way." Again, it's suggested there that the writer is foreshadowing that later in the text they will know each other, because at this point he still only knows her from a distance, from watching her, from getting on the train with her, and from reading about her in the newspaper. But just that final phrase, "we still did not know each other," does foreshadow that later in the text he is going to get to know her. So that would interest the reader, because again we are anticipating quite a dramatic event or a dramatic meeting between these two characters. So have a go at writing your answer to that question as well. Spend 10 minutes on both of them. Check your answers against the mark schemes, and then once you've done them, if you can either upload them as a Word document, or you might want to take a photograph and upload that if you're doing a handwritten version. Okay, good luck.